1918, a man sat down beside a Yakama elder and wrote down something that had never been committed to outside paper before. What the elder described was not a legend. It was a warning, still active, still remembered, passed down through generations of people who had lived beside these creatures. The Tah-tah-kle, taller than any man, wider than any woman, owl women who moved through the plateau darkness, speaking the language of their prey perfectly, every word, every accent, every name, until the person listening stepped close enough. Then they were gone. The man writing this down was L.V. McWhorter, a farmer, an outsider, a man the Yakama Nation had adopted and given the name Hemene Kawan, Old Wolf. He was not an anthropologist. He was not sent by a university. He had simply earned enough trust over enough years that William Charley, a Yakama tribesman, was willing to tell him what the plateau tribes had known since before the last creation. By the end of this documentary, you will understand why this account sat outside the written record for so long, what the Yakama actually said about these creatures, and why the tradition survived across multiple tribes in multiple languages, describing the same beings in nearly identical terms. The Yakama people have lived on the Columbia Plateau since long before any outside record of them existed. Their territory stretches across what is now south-central Washington state, from the eastern slopes of the Cascade Mountains to the edge of the Columbia River Basin. It is a landscape of wide open sky and treeless ridges, of river valleys cut deep into volcanic basalt, of places where the wind moves faster than anything else, and the darkness at night is total. This is not the Pacific Northwest of cedar forest and coastal rain. The plateau is a different country, drier, more exposed, the kind of terrain where distances are deceptive and where sound carries in ways that can be difficult to explain, where an owl calling from the ridge above a camp can sound, in the right conditions, remarkably close to a human voice. The Yakama knew this landscape the way people know a place after 10,000 years. They knew its plants, its river rhythms, its seasonal movements. They knew what belonged to it and what did not. And they knew, with a certainty that had been tested across generations, that certain things moved through the plateau at night that were not owls and were not people, and were not to be approached regardless of what language they used. The Tah-tah-kle lived here too. They had been here before the last creation, before the world took its present shape. And what the Yakama preserved about them was not a campfire story. It was information, specific, detailed, and internally consistent across more than one generation of witnesses. William Charley knew what he was describing. He was not recounting something he had read or heard secondhand from a stranger. He was giving McWhorter the account his own people had maintained, in their own language, for as long as anyone could trace. The Tah-tah-kle were women. That much was settled in every version of the tradition. Not creatures shaped vaguely like women, but women, or something that presented itself as women, taller and wider than any person the Yakama had encountered. Their size alone would have identified them at distance in open daylight. At night, on the plateau, with no frame of reference and no light source, size was impossible to judge. They were five sisters, Charley told McWhorter, who had existed since before the present world was established. In some versions of the account, they are described as having features associated with owls. The silence of movement, the range of vision, the ability to locate a target in complete darkness. They lived in caves, not temporary shelters, but deep, established cave systems, places they returned to and maintained across what the tradition implies were many generations. They ate what the Yakama did not eat: frogs, lizards, snakes. The specific listing of these animals in Charley's account is not incidental. Dietary transgression in Yakama tradition marks something as existing outside the natural order. The Tah-tah-kle consumed what was considered taboo not because food was scarce. They consumed it because they were not governed by the same rules that governed living people. And they could speak every language the plateau tribes used perfectly, without accent, without hesitation. A person walking alone at night, hearing their own name called from a direction they did not expect, would have no immediate way to know the voice did not belong to someone they trusted. That was the mechanism. That was what made them dangerous in a way that brute size alone would not explain. They did not only hunt, they communicated. They selected, and the people they preferred were children, small, faster to confuse, easier to take before anyone nearby understood what had happened. The account Charley gave McWhorter in 1918 includes a specific incident. 2 of the 5 sisters had come into a region where Shasta Indians were camped, digging roots. The camp knew they were in the area. That detail matters. This was not a surprise encounter. The people at this camp were being careful, had reorganized themselves to reduce risk, and were still operating in the presence of the Tah-tah-kle because they had no other choice. The roots were there. The season was right. Leaving meant something else went unfed through the winter. 1 child was taken, not killed, taken. The Tah-tah-kle caught a small boy. And here Charley's account makes a distinction that the tradition apparently preserved with some care. They did not take him to eat. They took him to raise, to keep, to bring into their cave and incorporate into whatever kind of life they maintained there. The boy survived. He understood he was being kept, not immediately threatened, and he waited. When the sisters were absent long enough, he ran. He ran over rough ground, through what Charley describes as wild places, until he reached people who knew him. That boy's escape is the closest thing in the recorded tradition to a first-hand account of what the interior of the Tah-tah-kle's world looked like. He was inside it. He was returned. And what he described when he came back, whatever the Yakama transmitted down through the generations, was enough that the tradition preserved both the danger and the specific detail of how the danger operated. McWhorter recorded a second account the following year. In 1919, a Yakama man named Tama Wash told him a different story involving the same creatures. In this version, the 5 sisters are still present, still working as a unit, still predatory. But the target in this account is not a child. It is a chief, a man named Owl, Shopautan, who had traveled up the Natchez River to hunt deer and found himself in terrain the sisters knew better than he did. The structure of this account is different from Charley's. Where Charley described the Tah-tah-kle as operating through mimicry and opportunity, Tama Wash's version emphasizes deliberate coordination. The sisters heard that Owl was in their territory. They planned. They moved to intercept. The predatory quality here is not the opportunism of something that happens upon a victim. It is something closer to what a hunting party does: identify, locate, coordinate, close. That Tama Wash told this to McWhorter 1 year after Charley, with no apparent coordination between the 2 accounts, and that both versions describe 5 sisters operating with similar methods across similar terrain, is not something that can be dismissed as 2 people repeating the same story to the same outsider. The internal consistency across two independent accounts from two different Yakama sources, given 1 year apart, describes something the tribe had preserved with care. McWhorter himself was not a neutral recorder. That matters, and the Yakama knew it. He had arrived in Washington state from West Virginia in the 1890s and had spent decades engaging with the Plateau tribes in ways most men of his era did not. He learned enough of the language to hold conversations without an interpreter in many contexts. He documented dispossessions, testified on behalf of tribal land claims, and was eventually adopted into the Yakama Nation formally, given a name, given standing, given a place in the structure of the community. Hemene Kawan, Old Wolf. The name was not honorary in the way that outside institutions sometimes issue honorary degrees. It carried specific meaning within Yakama's social structure. It meant McWhorter had obligations and standing, not simply access. He was, in the Yakama understanding of the word, one of them in a way that most ethnographers who passed through the region were not. This matters for how the 1918 and 1919 accounts should be read. William Charley and Tamawash were not speaking to a government agent, a missionary, or an academic who had arrived with a notebook and a set of predetermined categories. They were speaking to a man their community had formally incorporated. The decision about what to tell him and how much and in what language was made within that context. What Charley chose to share was specific enough to be useful. What he held back, if anything, is not recorded. What is recorded is what he said, in language McWhorter could follow, about beings the Yakama had preserved in memory for longer than any of the written records that now surround that memory. The tradition did not belong only to the Yakama. That is something the records make clear. And it is one of the details that transforms the 1918 account from a single tribe's preserved story into something that operated across a wider region. The Okanagan people, whose territory extended into what is now southern British Columbia, preserved a parallel figure. They called her Sneh-na, Owl Women. The name is different. The language is different. The geography is different. The Okanagan lived north of Yakama territory, in a landscape of higher elevation and colder winters, separated from the plateau by mountain ridges and river systems. There was no obvious mechanism by which a single storytelling tradition would migrate cleanly between these two communities and arrive at two different names describing the same set of behaviors. What the Okanagan preserved in Sneh-na and what the Yakama preserved in the Tah-tah-kle described the same creature. Female, larger than human, predatory, operating at night, associated with owl behavior, preferring children. The specific detail of language mimicry appears in both traditions. The cave dwelling appears in both traditions. The preference for children appears in both traditions. Two tribes, two names, two languages, one creature. That kind of cross-tribal convergence does not emerge from a single origin story being passed between neighbors. It emerges from two communities independently preserving memory of something they had both encountered, in overlapping or adjacent territory, over a period of time long enough that the core details held stable across the distance between them. The plateau region, where these accounts originate, is not an abstraction. It is a specific landscape with specific ecological characteristics that shaped how people moved through it, where they camped, when they traveled, and how exposed they were. The Columbia Plateau is not dense forest. There is limited natural concealment in large portions of it. A person moving across open ground at night, in the kind of darkness that exists far from any settlement, is visible against the sky in ways that a forest would prevent. Sound moves differently here. The basalt ridges and river cuts create acoustic channels, places where noise travels farther than expected and seems to come from directions that don't match its source. These are the conditions the Tah-tah-kle operated in. Not forest cover. Open plateau, rocky terrain, river valleys, caves and basalt formations. The Yakama knew every feature of this landscape, and still, in their preserved accounts, described beings that could move through it without detection. Not invisibly, the size of the Tah-tah-kle is emphasized too consistently for them to have been creatures that went unseen in daylight, but nocturnally. In the conditions where the plateau's own acoustic and visual properties made identification unreliable. The language mimicry becomes more significant in this context. In open terrain at night, where a voice carries far and its direction is hard to identify precisely, the ability to call someone's name in a familiar voice is not a small advantage. It is a decisive one. A person who steps toward a sound they expect is a person who has already closed most of the distance. The Yakama tradition records how the Tah-tah-kle ended, or how they were believed to have ended. Not with a battle that the living could recount in detail. Not with a war party and a documented outcome. The sisters were destroyed. The account says this plainly. But the mechanism is unclear even within the tradition itself. Charley's telling includes the phrase, "perhaps by a higher power," which is not uncertainty about whether it happened. It is uncertainty about what force was capable of it. The cave home of the remaining sisters became, as Charley described it, red hot and blew out. The language is specific in a way that casual invention rarely is. Not that the cave collapsed, not that the sisters fled. The cave became red hot. It blew out. Whatever the tradition is preserving in that description, geological, ceremonial, or something else entirely, it is describing an event violent enough and specific enough that the memory of it held across generations in that form. One of the 5 sisters drowned in the final confrontation. And from her eye, Charley told McWhorter, all owls were created. The owls alive in the world today, every species, every size, every pattern of feather, trace back to that one moment. The creature that had mimicked human language, that had hunted children across the plateau, that had lived in the basalt caves since before the last creation, did not entirely disappear. It reduced. It miniaturized. It became the owl that a Yakama person living today might hear calling from a ridge at night. The tradition preserves a specific relationship between the Tah-tah-kle and the owl. Not metaphor, not symbol, origin. The thing that hunted people became the thing that watches people. Same eyes, different scale. Researchers who have examined this tradition tend to reach for the most economical explanation first. A cautionary story, designed to keep children from wandering at night, explaining disappearances that had ordinary causes, giving a form to the fear that open plateau darkness produced in people who depended on knowing their environment. Keep the children close. Name the danger. Assign it a shape. Move on. That explanation does not require the Tah-tah-kle to have been real. It requires only that a community under real pressure, from predators, from the plateau's genuine darkness, from the genuine danger of a child wandering alone in terrain without natural boundaries, found a way to name and transmit that pressure across generations. But that explanation runs into the cross-tribal evidence. A cautionary story designed by one community to manage its own fear does not propagate into an adjacent community with a different language and produce a structurally identical account with a different name. The Snena of the Okanagan is not a borrowed Yakama story. It is a separate preservation of the same core description. For the cautionary story explanation to hold, both communities would have had to independently develop the same cautionary figure, with the same physical characteristics, the same behavioral profile, the same preference for children, the same cave dwelling, the same language mimicry, without context sufficient to explain the shared content. That is possible. It is not the only possibility. The Yakama relationship with the plateau shapes what gets remembered and how. A people who move with the seasons, who follow salmon runs and root grounds and hunting territories across a landscape they have mapped through 10,000 years of use, do not preserve oral traditions the way a sedentary population might. What survives is what has to survive. Information most necessary for understanding what the territory contains. The Tah-tah-kle tradition falls into that category. It is not preserved as entertainment, it is preserved as geography. Here is a thing that is in this place. Here is how it operates. Here is what happened to the people who encountered it and survived. That framing clarifies something that outside readings of indigenous oral tradition sometimes miss. When Charley told McWhorter that the Tah-tah-kle had been destroyed, he was not closing the story. He was updating the geographic record. The danger that had existed in a specific set of plateau locations, operating in a specific way, was gone. Something smaller had replaced it. The terrain was navigable again in ways it had not been before. That is practical information. It is transmitted because it was true and because its truth had consequences for anyone who moved through the same territory. The Okanagan parallel reinforces this. Two neighboring peoples, separated by mountain ridges and speaking different languages, preserved information about the same threat in the same terrain. The names differ because the languages differ. The descriptions do not differ because the creature did not differ. The plateau where the Tah-tah-kle were encountered is shared geography. The Okanagan moving south, the Yakama moving north, encountered the same landscape and the same thing in it. Each community preserved what it learned. Neither was aware that the other had done the same. The convergence of their records is not a copying error. It is independent confirmation. This is what makes the 1918 account worth examining alongside any other record. Not because it can be proven in the way outside scholarship requires proof, but because it represents a tradition that was maintained with enough rigor to converge with a parallel tradition it had no direct contact with. That kind of convergence does not happen by accident. What McWhorter recorded in 1918 and 1919 has never been formally disputed by outside scholarship. It has not been the subject of major academic controversy, not because it is insignificant, but because it fell into the category of material that was collected, filed, and largely left to those who knew where to look for it. McWhorter's papers, his journals, his correspondence, his field notes, the records he kept of decades spent among the Yakama, are held at Washington State University. They have been consulted by researchers, but they have not entered general circulation in the way that some other ethnographic collections have. The Tah-tah-kle accounts survive in those papers. William Charley's words, in the form McWhorter could write them down, describing creatures that the Yakama had maintained in living memory since before anything McWhorter had ever studied, existed as a category of knowledge. McWhorter spent more than 3 decades among the plateau tribes before he died in 1944. In that time, he accumulated something that academic institutions rarely produce: a record of what the Yakama chose to share with someone they trusted. Not what they said to government agents, not what they said to missionaries, not what they said to anthropologists who arrived with questionnaires and predetermined categories. What they said to Old Wolf, to the man they had adopted and named and given standing within their own social structure. That distinction matters more than it might appear. The history of indigenous oral tradition being recorded by outside observers is largely a history of what communities chose to give to strangers who would not return. The strategic disclosure, the version that satisfied the outsider's curiosity without compromising what the community needed to protect, is the version that entered most ethnographic records. McWhorter was not a stranger by the time Charley spoke to him. He had been coming back for decades. He had testified on the Yakama's behalf in land disputes. He had documented dispossessions and written letters and used whatever access he had to argue for people who were losing their territory to processes they had not agreed to. The tradition he received was, at minimum, a tradition the Yakama were willing to give him. Whether it was the complete version, whether it contained every detail that the community preserved internally, is not something the written record can establish. What the written record contains is specific, precise, and consistent with the Okanagan parallel. That is what survived. That is what is available to examine. The question of what was not transmitted, what Charley kept in his own community's internal record, for people who did not need it explained, is not answerable from the outside. It is not supposed to be. The tradition describes a world that preceded the present one. Before the last creation, Charley told McWhorter, before the tribes lived peaceably in this country. The Tah-tah-kle belong to that earlier world. They are not a feature of the current landscape in the way that rivers and ridges are features of the current landscape. They are a remnant, something that carried over from a previous arrangement of the world into the present one, persisting in the plateau's basalt cave systems while the world reorganized itself around them. That framing does something important. It does not place the Tah-tah-kle in the category of monster, a thing that exists as an aberration within the natural order. It places them in the category of survivor, something that was here before the current order was established and that continued to exist within it until the moment described in Charley's account when the cave went red hot and the sisters were destroyed. The current order, the world the Yakama live in now, includes owls. The tradition connects those owls to the destroyed sisters not as metaphor, but as transformation. The creature that hunted at night using language it had no right to speak became the creature that hunts at night in silence. What was lost in that transformation is voice, mimicry, the specific capacity that made the Tah-tah-kle dangerous in a way their size alone would not explain. An owl calling from a ridge cannot say your name. That is the difference. That is what the destruction accomplished. Not the elimination of the night hunter from the plateau. Night hunters remain. But the elimination of the one trait that made the night hunter able to reach through a person's own recognition and pull them forward. There is a question at the center of this that the tradition itself does not settle, and that the outside record cannot settle either. The Yakama preserved this account because it was true to them. Not true in the sense that a newspaper article is verified with photographs and corroborating sources and a chain of documentation. True in the sense that the community had determined, across generations, that this information was worth preserving and transmitting and protecting from distortion. That is a different kind of truth. It is not less rigorous. It operates by different mechanisms. What the Yakama remembered about the Tah-tah-kle survived without writing, without institutions, without any of the infrastructure that outside cultures use to maintain historical records. It survived because it was considered important enough to survive. Because William Charley, in 1918, still knew it well enough to tell it precisely to a man whose language and background were entirely different from his own. The owls on the plateau at night call from the ridges in the dark. They are not what they once were. That much the tradition is clear about. Something was lost when the cave went red hot and the sisters stopped moving through the plateau. Something reduced and miniaturized and became the thing that watches but no longer takes. Whether the Tah-tah-kle were what the Yakama understood them to be, creatures that existed in the physical world, that were destroyed in the physical world, and that left behind a physical remnant in the form of every owl alive today, is a question that 100 years of outside scholarship has not answered. The Yakama did not need outside scholarship to answer it. They preserved what they knew. They told it to the one outsider who had earned the right to hear it. And they told it precisely enough that it still holds its shape today. More than a century after McWhorter's pencil moved across the page in the light of whatever lamp was burning in the room where William Charley decided to speak. The cave is cold now. The sisters are gone. But the account remains, and the owls are still calling. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through indigenous testimony, historical records, and documented oral tradition, consider subscribing for more. And before you go, William Charley told McWhorter this account in 1918 and made a specific distinction. The Tah-tah-kle who took the child did not take him to eat. They took him to keep. What do you think that distinction meant to the people who preserved it? Leave your thoughts in the comments.